He claimed to be from another world. The history about Samuel Hawthorne will terrify you, Mary. Listen closely, because what I am about to tell you is not a legend meant to entertain, but a memory soaked into the frozen soil of a forgotten valley. In the dead heart of a merciless winter, something crossed into the mountain town of Milbrook, Vermont, and it did not arrive as a man should. It emerged from the storm itself, stitched together by snow, blood, and silence. They called him Samuel Hawthorne, a name that did not exist before that night. A name that appeared fully formed only after the blizzard had finished killing. By morning, the wind had taken lives across the county, leaving families hollowed out and roads erased. And standing at the edge of town was a figure who should not have survived at all. He spoke softly, with a voice worn thin by distance, telling stories of places beyond the mountains where survival demanded unthinkable choices. His eyes held something older than fear, something calculated and watchful, as though he were measuring every breath the town took. No one questioned how he knew so much about the human body, how his hands moved with unsettling confidence when sickness swept through Milbrook like a curse. During the winter fever, when children burned and strong men collapsed into delirium, Samuel Hawthorne became a savior. He bled, stitched, mixed remedies from knowledge no one could trace, and dozens lived who should have died. Gratitude blinded the town. Gratitude always does. What they could not see was the cost. For generations, locked drawers and sealed trunks have held papers never meant to be read, records preserved by the Milbrook Historical Society not out of pride but terror. These pages do not merely reveal who Samuel Hawthorne was. They expose what he became in the frozen peaks, and worse, what he continued to be long after warm fires and human voices surrounded him again. This is not a tale of endurance gone wrong. This is proof of how easily morality fractures when isolation strips away witnesses, and how monsters learn to smile when they realize salvation is the perfect disguise. Milbrook was the kind of town that believed it knew itself. Tucked between the green mountains, small enough for secrets to echo, it survived on stubbornness and routine. Farmers and loggers carved lives from unforgiving land, descendants of war-hardened settlers who thought distance from cities meant safety. Winter severed that illusion. Roads vanished. Supplies dwindled. The outside world became a rumor whispered over frozen mugs. That season was cruel beyond memory. The cold hardened even spirits soaked in liquor. Rivers thickened into glassy tombs. Men who had known polar winds admitted this winter felt personal, as though something was pressing down with intent. Main Street was the spine of the town, a scar of mud in summer and a corridor of ice when snow ruled everything. At its center stood Prescott's General Store, where every purchase and every rumor was written down with obsessive care. Those ledgers would later reveal patterns no one wanted to see, moments where Samuel Hawthorne appeared again and again, always near loss, always near disappearance. At the far end stood the Milbrook Inn, kept alive by a widow whose grief had taught her to notice details others ignored. She remembered how Samuel never truly slept, how he listened even when no one spoke, how his shadow lingered too long in doorways. The church watched over the square, white and solemn, its sermons growing thinner as faith struggled to compete with hunger and frost. Reverend Greenfield preached providence while his congregation prayed for mercy, unaware that something far more attentive than any god was already walking among them. Families huddled in wooden houses, burning through firewood and hope, counting preserved jars as if each one were a heartbeat. Even the most fortunate homes, with deep cellars and thick walls, felt the pressure of being watched by the mountains themselves. And through it all, Samuel Hawthorne moved like a quiet answer to every crisis. He listened, he advised. He planted ideas disguised as wisdom about survival, about what the body truly needed when rules failed. People leaned closer, desperate to believe. They did not notice how often he spoke of necessity, how easily he dismissed the boundaries that once separated human from unthinkable. By the time doubts began to surface, the town was already changing, shaped subtly by a philosophy born in starvation and perfected in secrecy. What followed Milbrook did not end there. Families vanished along routes Samuel traveled. Grief spread outward like frost, crossing borders, leaving authorities blind until patterns became undeniable and far too late to stop. The documents that remain were never meant for daylight because they force a question no civilized mind wants to answer. When survival becomes absolute, what are we willing to become, and who decides when the transformation is complete? This is the legacy of Samuel Hawthorne. Not a ghost, not a myth, but a mirror held up to the darkest edge of humanity. And once you see what stares back, the cold never truly leaves you. 80 years old and already known throughout Milbrook for a curiosity that refused to sleep, her questions echoing even when the fires burned low. And little William, barely past infancy, 5 years of fragile warmth, clutched so tightly by his mother that it was as if letting go might invite the cold itself to claim him. By the deep heart of February, Milbrook was no longer merely enduring winter. It was being slowly consumed by it. The town had crossed a threshold where hardship turned into dread, where each morning carried the quiet fear of discovering who would not wake again. 5 souls had already been taken by cold and sickness, and each death left a deeper silence behind. Old Henrik Bergstrom, the Norwegian logger whose laughter once filled the evenings, was found frozen solid in his cabin after a blizzard crushed his chimney and smothered his fire. Children stopped asking for stories of trolls and shimmering skies because his voice would never return. Then came the infant Fairchild, lost to a sickness that settled in the lungs and refused to leave. Dr. Putnam fought until his hands shook, but the child slipped away all the same, leaving the young mother hollow-eyed, wandering the town as if part of her had been buried with the snow. Worse than death was the waiting. Supplies thinned with every passing day. The wagons that once brought medicine, flour, and hope had vanished before winter sealed the mountain passes shut. No one expected to see another until the thaw, and by then, many feared there would be no one left to receive them. Dr. Putnam counted his remaining remedies with growing panic. Bottles stood nearly empty, tools dulled and chipped. Every decision carried the weight of choosing who might live and who would be left to fate. Whispers crept through homes and taverns alike, murmurs of a cursed season, of a town marked for forgetting. Some spoke of abandoning Milbrook altogether once the snow loosened its grip, if anyone survived long enough to leave. It was into this suffocating isolation that Samuel Hawthorne arrived, stepping out of the storm like a figure torn from a nightmare. He came bearing knowledge, confidence, and supplies that seemed impossibly timely. Too timely. What Milbrook would learn far too late was that gifts, given in desperation, often carry a price written in blood. The night he appeared became etched into memory as if carved with a blade. That evening, the blizzard had already swallowed the valley, burying it under relentless white. Young Timothy Prescott saw him first. The boy had been checking the store for damage when a shape emerged from the chaos beyond the windows. At first, Timothy thought exhaustion had finally taken his sight, that the storm itself was playing tricks on his mind, but the shape did not vanish. It advanced. The figure moved with a certainty that chilled those who watched. He followed the mountain path as though it were clearly marked, as if the storm bent itself around him in reluctant obedience. Men gathered quickly, drawn by equal parts curiosity and fear. They had seen travelers before, lost souls wandering until they collapsed into the snow. This was different. This man did not stagger. He did not hesitate. He walked. Against winds strong enough to bow trees, he remained upright. His pace never quickened, never slowed, a steady rhythm that felt deliberate, calculated. When he reached the edge of town, silence fell heavier than the snow. It was said later that he looked like death itself had escorted him to Milbrook's door and then stepped aside. His clothing unsettled them first. The outer layer resembled hide, yet not like any leather known to the hunters and trappers. It was thick, rigid, almost protective, shedding snow as if repelled by an unseen force. Beneath it, layered fabric caught the light strangely, glinting faintly as though threaded with something unnatural. His boots carved marks into the snow that made men glance at one another in uneasy confusion. The impressions were deep, precise, marked with sharp geometric patterns that suggested intention rather than fashion. Dr. Putnam would later record those tracks carefully, noting with quiet alarm that he had never seen their like in any known craft. Yet it was Samuel Hawthorne himself who disturbed them most. He claimed to have wandered for days through the storm, but his body told a different story. His fingers were whole. His toes moved freely. There was no blackened flesh, no stiffness, no signs of the frost that should have claimed him many times over. His skin held color. His voice did not tremble. His eyes were sharp, alert, calculating everything they fell upon. Dr. Putnam examined him with growing unease, documenting Every detail, as if instinct, warned him this man would one day need to be explained. Hawthorne's movements were fluid, his breathing calm. Nothing about him spoke of a man rescued from death. It spoke instead of someone who had mastered it. He stood taller than most, lean and angular, his dark hair streaked with premature white, as though time itself had brushed against him too closely. He appeared no older than a man in his prime, yet his gaze felt ancient, weighted by experiences best left buried beneath ice and stone. As he spoke of distant mountains and survival beyond civilization's reach, the people of Milbrook leaned closer, unaware that they were not listening to a warning, but an invitation. And as the fire crackled and the storm howled outside, something unseen shifted within the town. A door had opened. The cold had found a voice. And once Samuel Hawthorne crossed that threshold, Milbrook would never again belong solely to the living. His body told a story long before his words ever did. Every movement revealed a man shaped by endurance rather than comfort, forged by strain and repetition beneath open skies that showed no mercy. His palms bore the hardened ridges of someone who had carried unbearable weight for years, skin split, and healed so many times it had forgotten softness. His shoulders rolled forward with the ease of one accustomed to burdens, his legs coiled with the quiet strength of someone who had crossed impossible distances without complaint. This was not the posture of a drifter lost to chance. It was the stance of a survivor who had learned how to make the world bend or break beneath his feet. Yet it was his face that lingered in the minds of those who met him, refusing to fade even when they closed their eyes at night. Sharp angles carved his features, cheekbones rising like ridgelines beneath withered skin, a long nose lending him a watchful, almost hunting look. There was no sickness clinging to him, no hollowed cheeks or sunken gaze. Instead, his complexion spoke of strange health, as if hunger and deprivation had never truly touched him. And then there were his eyes. Pale blue, nearly drained of color, shifting with the light until they resembled ice stretched thin over deep, unseen water. When those eyes settled on someone, an unshakable discomfort followed, a sense of being assessed for reasons that could not be named. Children hovered near him, drawn by instinct the same way they are drawn to wild animals behind fences, fascinated by beauty wrapped around danger. Adults, however, felt something tighten in their chests, an urge to step back, to create distance without knowing why. Later, many would admit to the same chilling realization. Samuel Hawthorne did not simply look at them, he studied them. He absorbed details with unsettling precision, the structure of homes, the rhythms of daily life, the unspoken alliances and tensions that stitched the town together. It was as if he were quietly mapping Milbrook in his mind, committing his people to memory as one might inventory supplies. When he spoke, his voice carried flawless English, smooth and deliberate, yet touched by a cadence that belonged nowhere. It echoed familiar tones without ever settling into one origin. Those who had traveled could not place it, though fragments felt borrowed from distant lands and forgotten tongues. His vocabulary revealed careful learning, precise and controlled, yet every so often he slipped in words that felt out of time, expressions that stirred faint unease because they sounded older than the world Milbrook knew. Dr. Putnam later described it as listening to someone speak from between cultures, as though Hawthorne stood at the crossroads of many histories without belonging to any. When pressed to explain himself, his story unfolded slowly, like a curtain drawn back with intention. He spoke of lands beyond the peaks, of valleys where sunlight behaved differently, where the seasons followed ancient rule, no longer honored elsewhere. Whenever questions grew too sharp, his answers softened into abstraction. He spoke of his people, of traditions older than maps, of a homeland stretched across endless white fields where survival was not resisted but embraced. According to him, the wilderness was not an enemy to conquer, but a force to understand, one that demanded respect and, when necessary, sacrifice. He spoke calmly of necessity, of choices made without hesitation when life itself was at stake. The children listened with wide eyes, enthralled by tales that felt both wondrous and terrifying. The adults listened too, though dread curled beneath their fascination. Something about his presence unsettled them in ways reason could not soothe. The way he moved through rooms without sound. The way his gaze lingered half a second too long. The way he seemed to see through people rather than at them. as if flesh were merely an inconvenience to whatever awareness lived behind his eyes. Even those who tried to dismiss their unease felt their instincts recoil after prolonged exposure, a quiet warning echoing somewhere deep and ancient within them. What truly disturbed Milbrook, though few understood it at first, was what Samuel Hawthorne carried. A satchel fashioned from the same strange, resilient material as his garments never left his side. It rested against him like a living thing, always close, always protected. He referred to its contents as tools for survival, spoken with reverence rather than pride. In the desperate days that followed, no one questioned him. They could not afford to. What lay inside that bag would later haunt the town's memory, but in those early hours it appeared to be nothing less than salvation. That first night at the inn, as wind battered the walls and the fire struggled against the cold, Hawthorne warmed his hands around a dark mug, eyes reflecting the flames with unsettling calm, when young Sarah Thornbury began to cough, a harsh, rattling sound that sent fear through her parents. He did not hesitate. He listened closely, tilting his head as though the sound revealed something hidden beneath the surface. With quiet certainty, he spoke of smoke-filled air and lungs burdened by invisible poison, dismissing darker diagnosis with ease that bordered on arrogance. From his satchel, he drew a vial filled with liquid darker than pitch, its scent sharp with pine, and layered with a sweetness no one could identify. He instructed the girl to take a measured dose mixed with warmth, his tone leaving no room for doubt. Within a short time the coughing eased. By morning Sarah breathed freely, color returning to her face as if the sickness had been frightened away. The effect was immediate and profound. Hope surged through Milbrook like fire through dry timber. By dawn, whispers had become crowds. People lined up outside the inn clutching aches, fevers, and fears they had carried for weeks. Samuel Hawthorne worked tirelessly, diagnosing with a glance, prescribing with uncanny precision. Within days, he stood beside Dr. Putnam as an equal, though his methods defied everything the town had known. He identified ailments that had confounded trained eyes, located medicinal plants buried beneath unforgiving snow, and prepared remedies that worked with terrifying efficiency. Even Dr. Putnam, cautious and proud, found himself both impressed and unsettled. Hawthorne's knowledge did not feel learned, it felt remembered, and when Sarah Thornbury's condition threatened to worsen, when consumption loomed like a death sentence recalled from past winters, Hawthorne prepared a concoction unlike anything Milbrook had seen. Roots simmered with preserved mountain meat, prepared according to traditions he spoke of with solemn gravity, traditions that carried the weight of generations who had survived by understanding what others refused to see. As the town exhaled in relief, unaware of the cost, Samuel Hawthorne watched quietly. The fire crackled, the storm raged on, and beneath the fragile comfort of healing, something far darker began to take root, waiting patiently for the moment Milbrook would finally understand what it had invited inside. What followed unfolded slowly like rot spreading beneath fresh snow. The preparation of Hawthorne, as remedy, consumed the better part of a night. Hours marked by the low simmer of a pot he guarded closely. One by one, he drew containers from his satchel, each smaller than the last, as though the bag itself refused to reveal an end. Powders, dried fragments, dark oils sealed in glass that caught the firelight strangely, all combined with careful deliberation. As the mixture heated, a scent crept through the inn that no one could name. It was cloying and sweet, yet carried something underneath, a note that turned the stomach without warning. Several townsfolk would later say it reminded them of the week when Henrik Bergström. His body lay unfound, sealed inside his ruined cabin while the cold did its quiet work. Mrs. Foresk, who prided herself on knowing every smell a kitchen could produce, stood rigid as the odor filled her inn. She searched her memory for anything comparable and found nothing. When she asked what he was using, Hawthorne only smiled, that same thin curve of the lips that never reached his eyes, and spoke of ancient preservation practices passed down by his people, methods refined by generations who learned to live where mercy did not exist. His words were calm, almost reverent, as though he were sharing a blessing rather than a warning. The medicine achieved what no one dared hope for. Sarah, as strength, returned with unsettling speed. Within days, the pallor faded from her skin, and the fear that had hollowed her parents' faces loosened its grip. But the healing carried a shadow. At night, Sarah woke screaming, her dreams soaked in ice and motion. She spoke of endless white plains beneath a starless sky, of figures standing just beyond the edge of sight, watching, waiting. In her dreams they whispered promises of warmth and abundance, calling her to a feast beneath the snow where hunger would never return. She woke trembling, certain that something had followed her back. Gratitude drowned caution. Grace Thornbury insisted Hawthorne stay with them, offering the spare room above the kitchen despite her husband's uneasy silence. Thomas sensed something wrong but could not argue with the man who had pulled his daughter back from the brink. It was Grace who noticed the patterns, who began writing letters she never sent, pouring her unease onto paper as though ink might contain it. Those pages would later become evidence, quiet testimony from a woman who realized too late that kindness opened the door. Hawthorne slept little, never deeply. He rested in fragments, waking often, always alert, as though expecting a knock from something that knew his name. Grace saw him sitting at the window in the dead hours before dawn, unmoving, staring into the snowbound dark with an intensity that chilled her more than the cold. When storms raged hardest, when even seasoned woodsmen stayed close to their fires, Hawthorne vanished. He claimed he needed ingredients for his medicines, speaking as though the blizzard were a minor inconvenience rather than a death sentence, yet he always returned. His boots showed barely a trace of moisture. His satchel was heavier, and he brought meat, fresh meat. While local hunters rationed their autumn stores and spoke grimly of scarcity, Hawthorne laid out portions that looked newly cut, expertly prepared. He spoke casually of rabbits and deer taken during his journeys, of traps set beyond the ridgelines. The cuts were precise, almost ceremonial, but the hunters exchanged glances they never voiced aloud. Something about the bones felt wrong. The proportions did not match what they knew. The flesh itself carried a texture and hue that unsettled those who had spent lifetimes butchering game. Dr. Putnam noticed too. His training had taught him anatomy, the subtle distinctions between species. While examining the portions Hawthorne used in his remedies, he recognized patterns that made his stomach turn. Muscle fibers arranged too familiarly, cuts that mirrored those found in the human body. When he confronted Hawthorne, the stranger laughed softly, as though amused by a child's misunderstanding. He spoke gently of preparation, of methods that could transform even the toughest flesh. Survival, he explained, demanded freedom from civilized discomfort. All meat is meat, he said, smiling. What mattered was intention, respect, and the willingness to accept what nature offered without judgment. The words lingered like a stain. One morning Grace found him seated at the kitchen table, polishing a silver locket with meticulous care. He hummed as he worked, a low melody that twisted something deep in her chest. It reminded her of funeral songs from her youth, rhythms meant to guide the dead rather than comfort the living. When she asked about the locket, he spoke of a dear friend who could not complete the journey, whose spirit traveled with him still. His smile never faltered, but Grace recognized it. The pattern was unmistakable. She had admired it around Rebecca Henley's neck more than once. The delicate floral design brought from Ireland by Rebecca's grandmother. Rebecca and her husband had vanished months earlier while traveling through the mountains, swallowed by an early storm, leaving behind questions that froze into silence. No trace had ever been found. Grace said nothing. Fear pressed her lips shut. As days passed, Hawthorne's room became a source of growing dread. At night, sounds drifted through the floorboards, soft scraping, methodical and patient, like careful work done with small instruments. Sometimes there were other noises too, faint and broken, almost lost beneath the wind, sounds that might have been crying, or whimpering, or something trying very hard not to be heard. Grace lay awake, staring at the ceiling, counting her breaths, telling herself it was the house settling, the storm shifting, but deep down she knew better. The town had welcomed a healer, a savior, and somewhere in the quiet hours behind a closed door, Samuel Hawthorne was continuing work that did not end with medicine. Outside, the snow kept falling, burying Milbrook inch by inch. Inside, something far older than winter was settling in, patient and hungry, waiting for the moment when gratitude would finally turn into understanding. The sounds continued night after night, never random, never drifting like the groans of an old house surrendering to cold. They followed rhythms, pauses, intent. Grace felt it in her bones long before she could explain it, that what echoed from the room above was the product of careful hands rather than chance. When Thomas finally gathered the nerve to ask, his voice tight with forced calm, Samuel Hawthorne did not hesitate. He spoke as though the answer had been rehearsed. He claimed he was drawing maps to guide him home once the thaw arrived, and journals to preserve the wisdom he had gathered while living among their people. His tone was gracious, almost humble, as if he were honoring Milbrook with remembrance. To support his claim, Hawthorne unfurled his work. What he revealed silenced Thomas completely. The drawings were etched onto a material resembling hide, treated until it felt neither wholly organic nor entirely dead. Symbols crawled across the surface, accompanied by markings that mimicked roots and veins. At first glance, the images appeared beautiful in their complexity, but the longer one looked, the more disturbing they became. These were not simple routes sketched by a traveler. They were exhaustive. Every ridge, every ravine, every cave capable of sheltering a body from the storm. Places where one might hide, places where one might be found. More unsettling were the markings that defied translation. Symbols repeated again and again near certain locations, accompanied by strokes that resembled tallies, counts, records. Thomas could not explain why his mouth went dry as he stared at them, but some instinct deep within him understood that these maps were not meant for navigation alone. They were inventories. Dr. Putnam's unease hardened into resolve. What had begun as curiosity curdled into something colder. He started keeping his own records, notes written in a hand that grew increasingly frantic as patterns emerged. He tracked Hawthorne's patients carefully, observing not only their recoveries but what followed. The healing was undeniable. Fevers broke, strength returned, flesh filled out where sickness had hollowed it, but the changes did not stop there. Over time, those treated by Hawthorne grew restless. They spoke often of hunger, not the dull ache of winter scarcity, but a sharp, insistent craving for meat. They guarded their food fiercely, snapping at neighbors over scraps, their eyes flashing with a territorial edge that felt primal rather than rational. The shift was subtle at first, easy to dismiss as desperation. Yet it spread too consistently to ignore. Worse were the dreams. Patients described the same visions without prompting, recounting them in hushed voices, ashamed and frightened by their own minds. Endless fields of snow beneath dark skies. Shapes moving just beyond sight, voices offering warmth, sustenance, belonging, an invitation to a feast that promised freedom from hunger forever. The dreams felt shared, synchronized, as though seeded intentionally. Putnam began to fear that Hawthorne's remedies were not merely treating bodies, but reshaping minds. The moment of undeniable truth arrived in silence. Alone in his study, Putnam examined a sample of Hawthorne's medicine under magnification, using techniques he had learned years earlier in Boston. What he saw froze the blood in his veins. Strands that matched human hair, fragments of bone reduced to fine powder, tissue structures that no animal should possess. The evidence stared back at him, unarguable and monstrous. When he confronted Hawthorne, he expected denial, anger, threats. What he received instead was something far worse. Hawthorne smiled, eyes alight with genuine satisfaction. He praised Putnam's perception, his intelligence. He spoke as though welcoming a peer into a secret long kept. Yes, he confirmed, the doctor's conclusions were accurate. The most potent remedies came from the truest source of life itself. Human flesh, prepared with knowledge passed down through generations who had learned what survival truly demanded. As Hawthorne spoke, the room seemed to contract. He explained calmly that the human body contained everything required to heal another, if one abandoned superstition and fear. Consumed with the proper intent, human tissue forged bonds stronger than faith, deeper than prayer, a communion not of belief, but of shared substance. Putnam felt his stomach twist as the implications settled. This was not desperation, it was doctrine, the nightmares, the cravings, the slow erosion of disgust. It had all been deliberate, a systematic unmaking of civilized restraint. Hawthorne was not merely feeding the town forbidden meat. He was teaching them to accept it, to crave it, to need it. As winter loosened its grip and the days crept longer, Milbrook did not brighten with the promise of spring. It darkened. Hawthorne's reputation soared, his cures spoken of in reverent tones, Yet alongside the praise came incidents that defied explanation, disappearances whispered about, but never confronted, strange marks in the snow leading nowhere, the sense that the town itself was being reorganized around a new center of gravity. Putnam continued his observations, driven by a mixture of duty and dread. He catalogued Hawthorne's tools when he could. Instruments unlike anything he had encountered. Blades curved in ways meant not for healing but for removal. Saws designed for bone, their teeth arranged with grim efficiency. Bottles filled with substances that smelled of iron, rot, and something sweet beneath it all. When he asked questions, Hawthorne allowed just enough access to appear generous, always withholding what mattered most. And still, the healing continued. Milbrook slept, ate, and prayed under the illusion of salvation, unaware that its moral foundations were being quietly dismantled. Outside, the snow receded, revealing paths long hidden. Inside, the transformation deepened. Gratitude hardened into loyalty, fear softened into hunger. Samuel Hawthorne had not come to be rescued, he had come to cultivate. And as the town drifted closer to understanding, it no longer knew whether it wanted to be saved from him, or to become what he promised lay beyond fear, beyond hunger, beyond the fragile limits of humanity itself. Timothy Prescott had always been a curious boy, the kind who lingered longer than most by the edge of the forest, where the wind whispered secrets through the bare branches. That winter afternoon, bundled against the cold and the ever-falling snow, he wandered behind the Thornbury property, following a path he thought led to nothing more than old trees and hidden hollows. What he stumbled upon, though, was a hidden truth waiting patiently beneath the ice and fallen timber. At first he thought it might be animal, as done, perhaps the remnants of a collapsed mine shaft, something forgotten and small, but the opening was deliberate. Concealed by snow and logs, it lay hidden in a way that suggested calculation, the sort of precision a child might miss if he were not searching so carefully. Timothy crouched and cleared a few of the obstructions, heart hammering, breath frozen on his lashes. The hollow led to a natural chamber carved into the hillside, expanded and altered until it became a storage space of disturbing sophistication. The walls were lined with a hide-like material, strange to the boy's eyes, textured and firm in a way that suggested treatment beyond anything local hunters knew. As he explored, the sense of unease pressed tighter, wrapping around him like the blizzard itself. Inside were bundles, each wrapped in the same uncanny leather that cloaked Hawthorne's own body. He touched the first package and his fingers shook. Inside were clothes, shirts, dresses, winter coats, meticulously folded yet marked by cuts and stains that made Timothy's stomach churn. The garments weren't discarded or outgrown. They had been removed from the bodies of their owners. Small hints, a smear of dark crimson here, a fray there, whispered stories Timothy was far too young to comprehend. Fabrics from distant regions, different years, gathered as though the collection had been curated over time, each piece telling a fragment of a life abruptly severed. Among the clothing were personal items, pocket watches, rings, children's toys, delicate jewelry, prayer books, and crosses. Each piece preserved, cleaned, catalogued. Objects that belonged to people, cherished possessions that had vanished without explanation. And then he found the sketches, wrapped in oiled cloth to protect them from moisture. The drawings were precise and clinical. They depicted anatomy with a cold, mathematical accuracy, diagrams of cutting, preservation, and preparation. Some illustrated game animals, deer and bear and elk, but others unmistakably represented humans. Limbs, torsos, carefully annotated to maximize utility. The realization that these sketches treated human bodies as objects for sustenance made Timothy stagger back, panic coiling in his chest. He ran home, breath sharp in the winter air, and told his father, Jeremiah Prescott. His first reaction was disbelief. Ghost stories, fever dreams, too many tales around the fire. Yet the boy's insistence, the detail in his description, demanded attention. Together they returned to the hollow, and the reality could not be ignored. Every item confirmed Timothy's fearful imaginings. The most damning discovery came at the heart of the stash, a journal, its handwriting precise, matching the meticulous maps Hawthorne had shown Thomas. The entries stretched over years, documenting journeys into the mountains, encounters with traveling families, isolated wanderers. At first, the words read like survival notes, techniques for preserving supplies, for managing the wilderness, but soon a pattern emerged darker than anyone could have imagined. The author detailed stalking the vulnerable, approaching travelers under the guise of guidance, and leading them into traps during storms. The journal described these acts with chilling clarity, the language clinical, devoid of remorse. Families were killed with efficiency, their bodies processed for food and preservation. Every detail, how to maximize yield, how to store and prepare meat in the bitter winter months, how to utilize every part of the body for sustenance or for medicine. The horrors were not random acts of violence nor theft. They were systematic, methodical, practiced over years. The entries even included notes on the psychological effects of consuming human flesh, its ability to condition the mind, to break down instinctive revulsion, to normalize what civilized thought would condemn. It became clear, even to young Timothy, that Hawthorne's medicines, his miraculous cures, were inseparable from this dark system. Every vial, every concoction, every remedy that had restored strength and health to Milbrook carried the hidden truth that the body itself had been a tool, a resource, a vessel of power beyond natural understanding. Hawthorne was teaching the town to partake in what should have been unimaginable, guiding them subtly toward the ultimate taboo, eroding the line between life and sustenance, between healer and predator. The boy's revelation shattered the fragile illusions of Milbrook. The man who had appeared as a savior, who had walked through storms unharmed, who had healed with uncanny skill, was something far older than human kindness. He was deliberate, patient, calculating. Every act of generosity, every cure, every late-night excursion into the snow had been part of a long game, one that Timothy had glimpsed for only an instant but could not unsee. And in that moment, the town was still unaware of the magnitude of what had been introduced into their midst. They believed in the stranger's knowledge, in the warmth he had brought into their cold and hungry homes. They did not yet understand that with each grateful smile, each child restored to life, they were becoming enmeshed in a design older and darker than the mountains themselves. Samuel Hawthorne had not come to Milbrook to be rescued. He had come to harvest, to teach, to cultivate a new order hidden beneath the guise of care. The snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the valley, while inside, the shadow of something unending and patient settled among the living. Every object Timothy uncovered, every drawing, every entry in the journal, whispered the same dreadful truth, that Milbrook had invited into their homes not a healer, but the orchestrator of a quiet, inevitable transformation, a force that would stretch the boundaries of fear, hunger, and humanity itself, until the town could no longer distinguish between salvation and surrender. The journal revealed horrors that seemed almost too deliberate, too meticulously planned to be mere survival strategies. Hawthorne had not only chronicled his own methods, but had mapped the slow erosion of human instinct, the careful dismantling of revulsion and moral constraint. Each entry traced a systematic conditioning, a subtle, insidious process that began with small, almost imperceptible doses of human tissue concealed within other foods and medicines. Gradually, the proportion increased, until the subject's entire communities of unsuspecting villagers consumed human flesh as if it were any other sustenance, their minds reshaped by repeated exposure and psychological manipulation. The journal spoke coldly of changes in behavior, the dulling of conscience, the sharpening of appetite, the transformation of ordinary men and women into willing participants in acts they would once have found unthinkable. Jeremiah Prescott turned the fragile pages, his hands trembling, his mind struggling to comprehend the depth of Hawthorne's cunning. The evidence was not abstract. It was unfolding in real time in Milbrook. The miraculous cures, the vitality returned to the sick, the surging strength in those who had been on the brink of death all carried a hidden cost. Hawthorne was building not a town, not a community, but a carefully cultivated cadre of accomplices, and the realization hit Prescott like a hammer. The man who had rescued them from the merciless winter, who had walked through blizzards untouched and healed the sick with uncanny precision, was also orchestrating a dark, methodical transformation. The choice before Prescott was a torment. How could he accuse the man the town now worshipped as a savior? How could he reveal the truth without sending Milbrook into hysteria, or worse, allowing Hawthorne to vanish into the mountains before justice could be enacted? The weight of this knowledge pressed down on him, a crushing certainty that he alone now bore the understanding of what lurked behind Hawthorne's smile and miracles. The journal and sketches could not speak for themselves. The town's eyes were blinded by gratitude, by the warmth that had returned to homes and hearths. Only someone who saw the underlying mechanics, the systematic conditioning, could begin to grasp the full horror. Jeremiah confided in Dr. Putnam, the town's educated physician, hoping to anchor his fears in reason and strategy. Putnam's reaction was immediate and visceral. He had long suspected irregularities in Hawthorne's practices, unfamiliar herbs, unknown compounds, and miraculous recoveries that defied conventional medicine. Now Prescott's discoveries confirmed his darkest suspicions. Hawthorne's remedies were more than unorthodox. They were instruments of psychological engineering, of moral corruption, of transformation. Together, they began to scrutinize every aspect of his work, documenting behaviors, treatments, and the slow but unmistakable changes in the townspeople. Putnam pressed Hawthorne for details, probing into his supposed medical training and the origin of his techniques. The stranger's answers were evasive, woven with references to distant lands, ancient traditions, and sacred knowledge inaccessible to the uninitiated. When Putnam suggested collaboration, the possibility of documenting these methods for broader medical study, Hawthorne's composure faltered. His smile twisted into something sharper, colder. Sharing his knowledge, he insisted, would strip it of potency, endanger those unprepared, and betray the sacred rights of his people. Meanwhile, Prescott delved into the history of disappearances across New England, piecing together a mosaic of terror. Families vanished during winter storms, hunting parties never returned, lone travelers dissolved into the mountains as if swallowed by the snow itself. Records from towns spanning Vermont, New Hampshire, and western Massachusetts revealed a pattern: the appearance of a stranger in times of crisis, the provision of miraculous aid, followed by disappearances and eventual departures. Each figure, whether named Samuel Thorne, Samuel Blackthorne, or Samuel Hawthorne, followed the same sinister script. Trust was cultivated, reliance established, communities subtly transformed. The pattern was both elegant and horrifying. These strangers arrived during moments of desperation, offering salvation and relief. Their methods precise, efficient, compelling, ensured the townsfolk's dependence. Yet beneath the veneer of benevolence lay a coldly rational philosophy, survival through the redefinition of morality, the erosion of instinctive revulsion, the normalization of acts once unspeakable. Hawthorne's predecessors had practiced the same manipulations, leaving trails of vanished families and whispered rumors that never reached the wider world. Jeremiah felt the weight of inevitability pressing on him. Milbrook's gratitude had been the seed that allowed this transformation to flourish unnoticed. Every healed child, every recovered neighbor, was a step closer to a town reshaped, its moral compass slowly aligned with Hawthorne's design. The more Prescott read, the clearer the sinister intelligence became. This was not madness, not random cruelty, not chance. This was orchestration. Hawthorne was a cultivator of a particular kind of human, molding communities into willing participants in acts that civilization itself had forbidden. And yet, even as the horror unfolded in Prescott's mind, the snow fell relentlessly outside. Milbrook slept, unaware that beneath its roofs, in hidden pockets of warmth and trust, a slow metamorphosis was underway. The town had embraced a savior without realizing the price. Gratitude had been weaponized, reliance had been exploited, and through it all Hawthorne moved like a shadow, patient, methodical, always observing, always shaping, ensuring that when the time came, the town would not resist. Every note in the journal, every sketch, every carefully recorded expedition whispered the same truth. Hawthorne's genius lay not just in survival but in transformation. He had taught ordinary people to cross the boundaries of fear and morality, to accept the unspeakable as necessary, and to become instruments of the very philosophy that had guided him through years of storms, famine, and isolation. Milbrook's winter was no longer simply a season of cold and hardship. It had become a crucible, and within it, Hawthorne was forging something that would endure long after the snow melted, long after the town believed itself safe. Gospel of the Haunted. This is the moment when the Savior becomes the architect of dread, when the line between life-giver and predator dissolves, and when a community begins its slow descent into complicity, guided by a man whose eyes have seen the edges of human fear, hunger, and desire, and who knows how to make the living participate willingly in what they should never have touched. The barn was silent except for the low hiss of candle flames, flickering across rough-hewn beams and the uneven planks of the workbench. Thomas Thornbury's heart pounded as he stepped closer, drawn by the smell that had first made his stomach turn and now set his nerves ablaze. Spread across the bench was a large, raw piece of flesh, its color unnatural under the wavering light, glistening with a sheen that made his skin crawl. Hawthorne moved with precise, deliberate motions, slicing, trimming, and arranging the meat as though performing some sacred ritual, his hands steady, unhesitating, each cut deliberate and practiced. There was no hurry, no sign of panic, only the cold, exact rhythm of a man who had done this countless times before. Thomas's eyes widened in disbelief as he took in the reality of what he was witnessing. This was not livestock from the Thornbury farm. The shape, the texture, the subtle anatomical hints betrayed something far more sinister. His mind recoiled from the truth, but every instinct screamed it was there, undeniable. The barn, once a place of simple labor and honest work, had become a chamber of calculation, of preparation, of something that belonged to nightmares. Hawthorne paused occasionally, examining his work, murmuring quietly to himself in that strange, melodic cadence that had always unsettled the Thornburys. Each word, each phrase seemed to carry authority, teaching, and a warning all at once. Dr. Putnam's discoveries had made the picture horrifyingly clear. The miraculous cures, the vigor returned to the weak, the miraculous recovery. They were not simply the product of exotic herbs or strange medicines. Chemical analysis revealed a far darker truth: human tissue processed and hidden within his concoction, combined with compounds designed to alter brain chemistry, to dull conscience, to inspire craving. Those who had consumed his treatments became not merely dependent on them, but psychologically malleable. Their moral resistance eroded with each dose. The healing that had seemed so divine now revealed its shadow, a sophisticated system of conditioning molding the people of Milbrook into unwitting participants in acts their former selves would have recoiled from in horror. When Putnam had confronted Hawthorne with these findings, the man's reaction was terrifying in its casualness. There was no denial, no defensiveness. Instead, a faint smile curved his lips, and those pale, ice-like eyes gleamed with satisfaction. "Doctor," he said softly, "you begin to see the necessities of true survival. Civilization has its rules, but the wild, the mountains, the cold, their rules are fragile luxuries. The human body provides for itself if one possesses the knowledge to use it. What you call taboo is merely hesitation. My people learned long ago that hesitation kills." Hawthorne's calm, almost scholarly tone contrasted violently with the horror it conveyed. His voice carried authority, certainty, a reasoning that seemed to bend reality itself. Survival, he explained, demanded the abandonment of what civilization deemed sacred or untouchable. Food, life, sustenance, they were interchangeable in the crucible of extreme necessity. To him, morality was not a limit. It was a tool to be refined, reshaped, and ultimately set aside when survival and power demanded. Milbrook itself began to change. The behavioral alterations in those who had taken his medicines were subtle at first: a sharper glare, a possessive hold over food stores, a hunger that went beyond necessity. Gradually, the transformations deepened, spreading like a slow contagion. Children's games grew cruel and violent. Conversations about food and consumption acquired an obsessive precision. Adults hoarded belongings of the dead, claiming piety, but their possessiveness took on a predatory quality. Outsiders were no longer welcomed. They were assessed, measured, and weighed as potential prey. Even a stranger lost in a March snowstorm was met not with help, but with careful observation, the gaze of the people reflecting the same calculating hunger that Hawthorne himself exuded. The final, most shocking confirmation came one night in the Thornbury cellar. Grace Thornbury descended to find her youngest, Mary, a child of 8, crouched over a slab of salted pork, licking her bloody fingers, growling softly as any intruder approached. Her pale eyes mirrored the same predatory gleam they had learned to recognize in Hawthorne. Her words, disturbingly precise, echoed his teachings. "We must learn to eat what the mountain provides," she said, each syllable deliberate, her small hands clutching the meat as if defending sacred knowledge. The old people were wrong to waste so much food just because it came from 2 legs instead of 4. When we learn the right way to eat, we'll never be hungry again, and we'll never fear the winter. Horror settled in Grace's chest like ice. Her daughter had been transformed, conditioned to accept the unspeakable as necessity, to see cannibalism not as horror, but as wisdom. And this was not isolated. Milbrook itself had become an extension of Hawthorne's pedagogy, each cure, each meal, each lesson reinforcing the pattern. The town, under the guise of gratitude and survival, was drifting slowly toward complicity, guided by a man who had redefined morality, who had taught them to obey hunger as if it were sacred, and to see the ultimate taboo not as crime but as providence. And there, in the dim candlelight of the barn, Hawthorne worked with methodical care over the meat, his movements precise, ritualistic, and utterly calm. Thomas watched, paralyzed between terror and disbelief, realizing with dread that the line between life-giver and predator had vanished entirely. The town that had once relied on his miraculous skill now teetered on the brink of something unthinkable, and every shadow, every whisper, every flicker of flame seemed to pulse with the patient, deliberate influence of a man whose vision stretched far beyond mere survival, who knew how to shape fear, desire, and appetite into tools of obedience, and who had made the living willing participants in what they should never have touched. Milbrook would never be the same. The snow fell silently outside, burying the town inch by inch, while inside, something far older than winter pressed against the fragile veil of human civility. And Samuel Hawthorne, calm, precise, unerring, continued his work, shaping a community in his own dark, inexorable image. The barn smelled of iron and something more indefinable, something that clung to the air and made Thomas Thornbury's stomach twist. Candlelight danced across the room, illuminating the pale, fine-textured flesh laid out on the workbench. Bone structures were unmistakable human. Hawthorne moved with the practiced ease of a master, his strange, curved tools gleaming as they slid through muscle and sinew, separating cuts and wrapping them meticulously in treated cloth, each parcel marked with the cryptic symbols Thomas had seen in Hawthorne's journals. Around him were containers of organs, neatly labeled, organized with chilling precision. When Hawthorne noticed Thomas, he did not flinch, nor did he show embarrassment. Instead, he smiled a small, unsettling curl of lips and beckoned Thomas close, as though inviting him to witness a lesson in practical mastery. "Ah, Thomas," he said, calm, measured, almost gentle, "I was hoping someone in the family would take an interest. Your children are already showing remarkable aptitude in understanding the new ways. It is only fitting that you witness the practical applications of what we are doing." Thomas froze in the doorway, every part of his mind screaming yet unable to look away. Hawthorne continued as though speaking about ordinary farm chores, not dissecting human remains. "This," he said, gesturing to the meat, "was a traveler who succumbed to the winter's exposure last week. Valuable resources must not be wasted. What is preserved can benefit the community. Your daughter Mary's recovery was aided by portions of this tissue. That is why she healed so completely, so swiftly." Thomas's mind recoiled in disbelief. "You're feeding my family human beings?" he whispered, voice barely audible. Hawthorne's pale eyes glimmered with calm authority. "No, Thomas, I am feeding your family the most potent sustenance imaginable, both for body and spirit. In my homeland, sharing the flesh of our own creates bonds beyond ordinary kinship. The participants of this sacred feast enter into an eternal communion transcending life and death." He set his tools aside, turning slowly to Thomas, his gaze almost evangelical in its fervor. "Your family is being transformed. They are learning to endure hunger, cold, and isolation. They are seeing the world as it truly is, a place where the strong thrive, where waste is unforgivable, and where every death offers the chance for continued life." The weight of his words pressed on Thomas like a physical blow. Hawthorne's doctrine of survival was no longer abstract. It had already been implemented on his children, shaping their minds, their appetites, and their morality. The influence spread beyond the barn, seeping into the streets and homes of Milbrook. The townspeople were changing. The cravings for meat grew more urgent. Children whispered in the dark about cutting, slicing, preserving. Adults hoarded personal effects of the dead, justifying it as reverence, yet their behavior was predatorily possessive. Outsiders were no longer welcomed but silently assessed, evaluated for threat or nourishment. The breaking point came one night in the cellar. Grace Thornbury descended the stairs to find Mary crouched over a slab of raw pork, her tiny hands smeared with blood and grease, growling softly as she defended her portion. Her eyes shone with the same predatory gleam Thomas had come to recognize in Hawthorne's disciples. Her voice, chillingly precise, echoed the lessons Hawthorne had instilled. We must eat what the mountain provides. The old people wasted good food because it came from 2 legs instead of 4. Learn the right way, and we will never hunger again. Never fear winter again. Horror settled like ice in Grace's chest. Cannibalism had become pedagogy. Acceptance of the unthinkable was being taught as virtue, and this was not limited to her child. Milbrook itself was the classroom. Every cure, every morsel, every lesson reinforced the ideology. The town, under the guise of gratitude and survival, had begun a slow drift into complicity. Each resident, shaped by Hawthorne's philosophy, fear transformed into obedience, hunger transformed into reverence. Outside, the snow fell silently, burying Milbrook under a pristine white blanket, while inside, the barn's candlelight threw shadows that moved with deliberate intent. Hawthorne worked tirelessly, each motion precise, ritualistic, methodical. The line between healer and predator had dissolved. Thomas realized the truth. Milbrook was being drawn into a web from which there could be no easy escape. A man who had saved them from winter's cruelty was orchestrating their moral and psychological unraveling. That night marked the beginning of March 15, 1847, a night later remembered in whispers as the bloodiest in Milbrook's history. Dr. Putnam and Jeremiah Prescott had gathered evidence convincing Reverend Greenfield and other leaders that Hawthorne was a mortal threat. Disappearances, strange behaviors, and the unsettling transformations had reached a breaking point. They approached the Thornbury home, determined to act. What greeted them was a tableau of nightmares. Candlelight flickered in every window, casting moving shadows that seemed alive, deliberate. From within came a rhythmic chanting, a heartbeat woven into song, a cadence that pressed against reason itself. Thomas met them at the door, but the man before them was no longer simply a farmer. His eyes were vacant, predatory, intensified beyond human recognition. Movements were fluid, deliberate, and the smile he offered revealed teeth sharpened by intent. The house itself seemed alive with anticipation, as if every beam, every shadow, and every breath had been arranged to signal the arrival of something far darker than the townspeople could have imagined. In that moment it became clear Hawthorne's work was complete. Milbrook had passed the threshold. The snow outside was irrelevant now, a silent witness to the quiet transformation of a town. Guided by a man who knew how to bend hunger, fear, and obedience into instruments of his dark vision, and Samuel Hawthorne, calm, methodical, unstoppable, continued his work, shaping Milbrook into an inexorable reflection of his own unflinching, terrifying logic. Grace Thornbury stood behind him in the hallway, motionless, her hands stained with dark, unidentifiable substances, her dress torn and smeared in ways that made Thomas's stomach churn. Her hair fell in loose, tangled strands around her shoulders, yet her face bore a serene, almost beatific expression, an eerie calm that somehow felt far more terrifying than hysteria ever could. Thomas's own voice faltered as he spoke, the words carrying an unfamiliar cadence, a rhythm borrowed from Hawthorne himself. "Samuel has been teaching us about true survival," he said, each syllable heavy, deliberate, as if rehearsed in a language Thomas barely recognized, a language that spoke of communion in the harshest winter, of sacred obligations tied to the understanding of sustenance itself. "Would you like to learn?" Dr. Putnam pushed past Thomas, his rational mind overriding the terror clawing at his chest. Inside the house, The scene was something that would haunt him until his dying breath, a nightmare of religion, ritual, and butchery intertwined so completely it shattered his conception of humanity. The main room had been transformed, furniture rearranged, the Thornberry's dining table moved to the center like an altar, chairs encircling it with geometric precision. Around this macabre centerpiece sat the remaining members of the family grace: Sarah, Mary, William motionless, eyes glazed, expressions predatory, the same blank hunger Thomas had begun to notice in himself. Neighbors who should have been long gone also sat among them, equally still, equally consumed. In the middle of it all knelt Samuel Hawthorne, his movements meticulous, precise, as he worked over the white cloth now stained dark with the unmistakable signs of dismemberment. At first, Putnam's mind tried to deny it, to call it livestock or an unfortunate accident, but as his eyes adjusted, the truth slammed into him with physical force. The remains were human, carefully separated, laid out like a grotesque lesson, the pieces of flesh and bone, arranged as though for some sacred, unspeakable feast. Containers lined with symbols from Hawthorne's journals held organs and other parts, each labeled, catalogued, sanctified in their own horrifying way. "Ah," Dr. Hawthorne said without lifting his eyes, calm as ever, measured, authoritative, perfect timing. "We are conducting the final stage of young Mary's initiation. Theory can take one only so far. True understanding requires direct participation in the sacred feast." His tools gleamed in the candlelight like ritualistic instruments, not surgical implements. The families who vanished in the mountains, he explained, did not die of exposure, nor of hunger. They had been absorbed into a greater cycle, resources transformed, life redistributed. To those capable of preserving it, guiding it, wielding it with knowledge and purpose. Putnam's stomach turned as he realized the entire room, every person in it, stared at him and his companions with a focus that was both intelligent and feral. Whatever Hawthorne had administered, whatever conditioning he had applied through his medicines and teachings, it had remade these people. Hunger, obedience, even morality had been reshaped. The veneer of civilization had been stripped away, leaving something primal beneath. "You've been drugging them," Putnam whispered, voice barely audible, his medical mind piecing together the chemical and psychological mechanisms at work, conditioning them for acceptance. Hawthorne looked up at him then, pale eyes glowing with quiet triumph, voice rising with fervor like a preacher delivering the sermon of his life. "To embrace reality, Doctor, is to recognize what your society denies. Survival demands that the strong consume the weak. That worst is the ultimate sin, that the human body is the perfect source of life for its own kind. My homeland, wherever winter bites deepest and resources are scarcest, taught us that fellowship requires sacrifice. The many sustain the few who can lead them through darkness." The implication pressed in like snow on a roof, overwhelming, suffocating. These were no longer fearful, frail villagers. They had become a single organism of predation and purpose, strong, unified, capable of enduring whatever the world hurled at them. Their morality had been replaced by efficiency. Their fear of death had been channeled into reverence for survival. Reverend Greenfield, silent until that moment, finally found words, though his voice trembled with disgust and disbelief. "You speak of cannibalism, of murder, of turning these people into monsters, abandoning everything that separates man from beast." Hawthorne laughed, not the shrill, unhinged laugh of madness, but calm amusement, the sound of a man surveying ignorance and finding it pitiable. "Monsters," he said, tilting his head. "Look around you. These people are stronger, healthier than they have been all winter. Their children grow, their skills flourish. Their families are united in purpose, guided by principle and action, in ways your hollow promises of heavenly reward could never achieve." The snow fell silently beyond the windows, white and unbroken, irrelevant to the transformation inside. Milbrook had ceased to be a town and had become a crucible. Under Hawthorne's precise, methodical hands, the veil of civility had been lifted. Fear, hunger, obedience, everything had been forged into instruments of his design, shaping a community, not of individuals, but of willing participants in a philosophy that eclipsed morality. And Samuel Hawthorne, calm, unrelenting, unstoppable, knelt among his creation, continuing his work, shaping Milbrook into a dark reflection of himself, where the line between human and predator no longer existed, and where the future would be written in blood, obedience, and the quiet, unyielding logic of survival. The words Hawthorne had spoken echoed in Thomas Thornbury's mind, a mantra of horror disguised as salvation. I've given them something infinitely more valuable than your abstract moral principles. I've given them the tools and the mindset to survive anything this world can inflict upon them. Those tools had been forged in secrecy, honed over months of psychological manipulation, chemical conditioning, and the quiet, insidious destruction of every boundary the townspeople had once taken for granted. And now, when Milbrook's last defenders came to confront him, those tools became weapons in the hands of those he had remade in his image. The confrontation erupted with a force and coordination that no one had anticipated. Hawthorne's converts moved as a single organism, fluid and synchronized, a pack of predators who had learned together, trained together, and now defended their new order with lethal instinct. Thomas Thornbury, his hands once accustomed to plowing fields and tending livestock, became instruments of feral violence, claws raking across Constable Hartwell's face before the man could draw his pistol. Grace Thornbury revealed a butcher's knife from beneath her bloodied dress, advancing on Reverend Greenfield with a focus and determination that chilled the heart. And the children, Sarah, Mary, William, they were horrors clothed in innocence. Their small bodies darted under defenses, weaving between legs and shadows, delivering strikes with a precision that betrayed the unnatural rigor of their training. They carried no hesitation, no doubt. The predator had replaced the child, leaving only the outward guise of youth to deceive and terrify. Dr. Putnam found himself fighting for his life against neighbors he had known for years, people whose ailments he had healed, whose births he had attended, but their faces were masks now, moral frameworks erased, replaced with something primal, something relentless. The battle became a maelstrom of desperation, fought in the confined corridors and cramped rooms of the Thornbury house. Knives flashed, farm tools swung, fists collided with faces and ribs, the sounds echoing like a perverse symphony. Every strike, every parry carried the weight not just of self-preservation, but of ideology. Hawthorne's converts were defending not merely their lives, but the philosophy that had remade them, the doctrine of survival that demanded the strong consume the weak and bend morality to necessity. And those outside, the remnants of Milbrook, fought with the understanding that failure would mean not just death, but the obliteration of the principles that had defined their humanity. Dr. Putnam barely escaped with his life, bleeding from multiple wounds, his mind saturated with images that would haunt him forever. Joshua Foresk reached his horse and rode desperately toward Bennington to summon outside aid, though the mountains and snow conspired against him, and he would never arrive. The others, Reverend Greenfield, Thomas Thornbury, Constable Hartwell, disappeared into the darkness of the house, swallowed by the nightmare that Hawthorne had created. By dawn, half of Milbrook's remaining population had rallied to confront the threat, but they were no longer facing a single man. They faced an entire community of converted predators, organized, conditioned, and utterly loyal to the philosophy instilled in them by Hawthorne. The siege lasted 3 days and 3 nights, a grim, intimate war waged within walls that had once been familiar and safe. Barricades and defensive positions, carefully planned and reinforced, slowed the attackers, but could not diminish the coordinated efficiency of Hawthorne's followers. They had stockpiled food, weapons, and medicines, each preparation reflecting a mind obsessed with survival and control. They moved like soldiers, not civilians, employing ambushes, psychological manipulation, and terrain advantage to shatter the morale of those trying to reclaim their town. The greatest weapon, however, was the converts themselves. Seeing neighbors, friends, family people they had loved and trusted transformed into killers and predators who would defend Hawthorne's philosophy with feral precision, broke the attackers in ways bullets and blades could not. Fathers hesitated to strike their children, wives flinched against husbands, and all felt the unbearable weight of recognizing the familiar twisted into something alien. Dr. Putnam recorded every agonizing moment, every betrayal of instinct and trust, in journals that would later stand as a testament to the most horrifying example of mass psychological conversion in American history. On the morning of the third day, the siege ended not in victory, not in resolution, but in disappearance. When the survivors finally breached the Thornbury house, it was empty. The echoes of violence lingered, the evidence of hasty departure everywhere, barricades dismantled, supplies removed, the lingering metallic scent of fear and blood hanging in the air. Samuel Hawthorne and his most devoted followers had vanished into the mountains, taking with them weapons, provisions, and those who had been remade in his image. Milbrook remained, scarred and shaken, haunted not only by the memory of what had happened within those walls, but by the knowledge that the orchestrator of their nightmare still existed, patient, calculating, and always observing from the shadows. The town had survived, but Milbrook was no longer the Milbrook that had welcomed a stranger in need. Under Hawthorne's influence, its people had glimpsed the terrifying possibilities of obedience, adaptation, and predation. The line between human and predator had been redrawn, and even in his absence, Hawthorne's work continued, etched into the minds, bodies, and souls of those who remained. And somewhere in the mountains, the man who had taught them to survive by any means, who had converted fear into hunger, obedience into purpose, waited. Calm, methodical, unrelenting, Milbrook's nightmare had ended, but Samuel Hawthorne's influence, the dark, inexorable shaping of humanity, was far from over. The mountains swallowed the echoes of Milbrook's terror, leaving the town hollowed and broken, its people forever scarred by the lessons of Samuel Hawthorne. Of the 43 who had fallen under his influence, only a dozen ever returned, trickling back into the town with hollow eyes and silent mouths, unwilling or unable to speak of what they had endured in the wilderness, of the unthinkable communion they had shared with their former teacher. Each survivor carried the invisible scars of transformation and instinctive wariness, a subtle predatory glance, a knowledge that they could never unlearn. Most of these ghosts did not linger. Within the year, many fled Milbrook entirely, unable to bear the accusatory stares or the whispered suspicions of neighbors who could never be certain the conditioning had been reversed. Some vanished into distant cities, seeking anonymity and the chance to bury their pasts beneath new identities. Others simply disappeared into the endless American frontier, drifting toward communities where their sharpened instincts, strange knowledge, and acquired ruthlessness would draw less attention, or perhaps where they could teach what they had learned without restraint. Dr. Putnam spent the remainder of his life piecing together the fractured puzzle of Hawthorne's work, recording every detail he could recall about the methods, the medicines, the psychological conditioning, and the systematic way in which a town of ordinary citizens had been transformed into a disciplined, cannibalistic community. His journals, now housed in the restricted archives of the Vermont Historical Society, remain the most comprehensive testimony to what many scholars consider one of the earliest documented cases of mass psychological manipulation in the United States, an experiment in overriding the most fundamental moral taboos. The physical evidence only confirmed the nightmare that Dr. Putnam feared. When spring melted the snow, search parties found multiple caches scattered across the mountains, each containing preserved human remains, personal effects of the long missing, and implements of butchery and preservation, items carefully arranged, carefully labeled, a testament to meticulous planning and horrific foresight. The scale of Hawthorne's operations was staggering. Not a single winter, not a single crisis had been wasted. For over a decade he had roamed New England, preying on travelers and isolated families, refining his techniques of human preservation, psychological conditioning, and community conversion. The mountain caches revealed the full scope of his methodology. Each site contained instruments for dismembering and preserving human flesh, chemical compounds used to condition the minds and bodies of his victims, and records detailing every step of his work. The precision and consistency suggested a network of operatives, assistants, that went beyond Hawthorne himself, hinting at a larger organization, one that monitored his experiments, guided his strategy, and perhaps even trained others in the same relentless philosophy. The most chilling discovery came in late April, when a hunter stumbled upon a permanent settlement deep in the mountains, hidden from all paths, a place that had never been mapped. Here were workshops, strange surgical tools, preservation chambers, and journals that detailed experiments in what Hawthorne called survival psychology. These were not acts of opportunistic predation. This was deliberate, carefully calculated, a program of civilization stripped to its barest essentials, designed to teach survival at any cost. Conventional morality was abandoned in favor of cold efficiency. Every experiment, every converted community, every disappearance had been a test in pushing human societies past the boundaries of fear, revulsion, and obedience. Hawthorne's journals traced his work across New England over nearly 15 years. Each experiment followed the same deliberate pattern: infiltration during times of crisis, earning trust with genuine medical assistance, slowly introducing unconventional survival techniques, conditioning entire communities to overcome instinctive revulsion, and ultimately converting or eliminating all witnesses. The precision with which he orchestrated these cycles was terrifying. He identified vulnerable towns, mapped their resources and weaknesses, and executed plans that would maximize the likelihood of total compliance. Worse still, Hawthorne was not the originator of the system. He was a field operative, meticulously following directives from a council of unseen directors, part of a shadow network obsessed with testing survival strategies under conditions that pushed morality to its limits. His instructions hinted at long-term planning, extensive resources, and a vision that extended far beyond Milbrook. He was one of many, a single instrument in a vast, incomprehensible project dedicated to redefining human resilience and survival. Despite extensive searches, Hawthorne himself was never found. Authorities scoured the mountains, federal marshals and military units deployed to capture him, but the man vanished as silently as he had arrived. Some theorized he had perished in the wilderness, isolated and vulnerable without the infrastructure he had built. Others feared he had simply moved on, ready to repeat his horrors in a new town, a new experiment, where the traces of his past atrocities would not betray him. And the truth may have been far darker than either possibility. By 1851, reports began to surface from the remote reaches of northern Maine, accounts of a pale-eyed stranger arriving in the dead of winter, offering medical assistance, survival guidance, and the quiet authority that had once commanded Milbrook. By 1854, similar sightings appeared in isolated regions of New Hampshire. Witnesses described a man whose calm precision and insight into human need were uncanny, whose presence inspired immediate trust and compliance in communities on the edge of disaster. The specter of Hawthorne had not disappeared. He moved like a shadow through the wilderness, shaping, observing, and waiting. Communities he touched emerged stronger in body and sharper in instinct, yet each bore the invisible imprint of his influence, a subtle conditioning that would endure for generations. Milbrook had survived, but its lessons had spread, carried in the eyes of those who had glimpsed the dark promise of survival untethered from morality. And somewhere, beyond the reach of maps or memory, Samuel Hawthorne remained. Calm, deliberate, unrelenting, shaping his philosophy into the fabric of humanity wherever fear, hunger, and desperation existed. The snow of past winters had long melted, but the shadow of his methods, the inevitability of his influence, lingered like a pulse in the mountains. Milbrook's nightmare had ended, yet Hawthorne's work, the inexorable, chilling transformation of human nature, was far from over. Every new account followed the same dark pattern that had engulfed Milbrook, a terrifying rhythm of human manipulation that Samuel Hawthorne had perfected over decades. A town or a small, isolated community would find itself in crisis, desperate, vulnerable, teetering on the edge of despair. Then he would appear, calm, deliberate, a stranger claiming knowledge beyond the reach of ordinary folk. Trust was earned slowly through meticulous care and astonishingly effective remedies. Illness would recede, food supplies would stretch beyond reason, morale restored almost miraculously. And then, as if unnoticed, the lessons would begin, the gradual introduction of practices that seemed strange but reasonable at first, survival methods that pushed boundaries, then morality itself, until the community was transformed, either entirely converted to his ways or scattered into the wilderness, some never seen again, swallowed by the mountains or his plans. The last recorded sighting of someone matching Hawthorne's description occurred in 1859 far from Vermont, in a mining camp deep within northern Michigan. That winter had been brutal beyond anything the miners had endured, a frozen expanse where hunger and exhaustion made men susceptible to the allure of any authority offering hope. Witnesses recalled a man with pale eyes, prematurely white hair, who spoke of distant forests where survival was honored above all else. He stayed 3 months, guiding the miners with an unnerving calm. His medicines cured ailments that had already claimed lives. His instructions on rationing and preservation kept the camp alive while temperatures remained unforgivingly below zero. He taught them patience, vigilance, and the art of using every resource with precision. And then, when spring finally arrived with the company's supply wagons, he vanished. Not alone, 12 miners disappeared with him, leaving the camp forever altered. Decades later, industrial records revealed the haunting aftermath. The remaining miners exhibited the same obsessive behaviors observed in Milbrook's survivors. Food hoarding became ritualized, dietary preferences turned grotesquely specific, often involving raw meat. Social hierarchies had shifted, establishing authority and survival as intertwined, twisted forms of obedience. Communities that should have functioned according to conventional rules had instead been reshaped by Hawthorne's invisible hand, molded into microcosms of his philosophy. Dr. Putnam's final journal, written shortly before his death from pneumonia in 1863, warned with chilling clarity. Hawthorne understood something fundamental about human nature that society prefers to ignore. Give the right guidance, the correct methods, and enough time, and any person can be convinced that the unthinkable acts of brutality, betrayal, even cannibalism can be not just acceptable, but essential. Hawthorne did not invent monsters. He revealed the ones that already existed, dormant within ordinary men and women, waiting for permission to surface. Putnam's words prove disturbingly prophetic. Within 14 years of Milbrook, the American Civil War erupted, and countless ordinary citizens committed atrocities that would have been inconceivable in peacetime. Industrial disasters, frontier conflicts, social upheavals all demonstrated how rapidly human communities could descend into savagery when survival became the ultimate law. Modern research in psychology and social conditioning confirms many of Putnam's observations. Hawthorne had relied on techniques that cults, militaries, and survival programs continue to exploit. Gradual introduction of extreme ideas, cultivation of dependency, isolation from alternative perspectives, systematic erosion of moral boundaries through incremental, seemingly reasonable steps. The most unsettling truth of Hawthorne's story is that it did not rely on supernatural power, luck, or random cruelty. His horror was deliberate, methodical, and terrifyingly human. He manipulated instinct, fear, hunger, and obedience, reshaping communities from the inside out, until civilization itself became fragile, mutable, a veneer over the primal rules of survival. He blurred the line between healer and destroyer, teacher and corrupter, showing that when survival alone becomes the guiding principle, morality becomes optional, humanity negotiable. So we are left with the shadows he cast. Was everything about Hawthorne revealed in Putnam's journals, or did deeper layers of his identity and his organization remain hidden in the wilderness? Did the network of survival communities continue, quietly thriving in remote corners of the country, replicating his grim experiments wherever human vulnerability appeared? The story challenges us to confront a frightening possibility. The greatest threats in history do not always come from external enemies or supernatural forces, but from those who understand our minds, our instincts, and the delicate livers of trust and obedience. If the tale of Samuel Hawthorne unsettled you, consider what lurks beyond the edges of recorded history, where the mountains hide their secrets and the human heart can be molded with patience, precision, and a terrifying understanding of what we are willing to do to survive.